Hey everyone, today let's take a dive into one of the most interesting periods of European history, the Slavic migrations to the Balkans. So, imagine this. It's the middle of the 6th century, and the Slavs are on the move, spreading into southeastern Europe. This wasn't just a small trickle, but a major migration that carried on into the early 7th century, during what we now call the early Middle Ages. The reason behind this mass movement: a mix of events. First, the plague of Justinian had wiped out a lot of the local population, making it easier for the Slavs to move in. Plus, there was the late antique Little Ice Age. Yeah, it was a thing. And if that wasn't enough, there were constant wars between the Eastern Roman Empire and groups like the Sasanian Empire and the Avars. Interestingly, the Avar Khaganate's backbone was made up of these very Slavic tribes. One of the big moments during this migration was in 626, when the Slavs, along with the Avars, tried and failed to capture Constantinople. After that, many of the Slavs just stayed put in the region. By then, they had already moved into Byzantine territory, settling south of the Sava and Danube rivers, spreading from the Adriatic Sea all the way to the Black Sea. Byzantium, already dealing with a ton of issues, had to accept the new reality. They couldn't fight on multiple fronts, so they struck a deal with the Slavic groups, known as the Sclavinias, forming alliances to counter their other enemies like the Avars and Bulgars. Now, to understand the context, before the Slavic migration, southeastern Europe was home to a mix of ancient Greeks, Illyrians, Thracians, and Romanized peoples. Some groups like the Heruli Bastarni and Longobards were also around, but things took a sharp turn after the Huns and Goths ravaged the area. Emperor Justinian I had started rebuilding fortresses and promoting Christianity, but the devastating plague of Justinian weakened the defenses along the Danube. This opened the door for the Slavs, who were often led by the Pannonian Avars, to move in. By the mid-6th century, the Slavs were already making their presence known. They raided Roman territories, and these attacks became even more frequent during the reign of Emperor Justinian I. Procopius, a historian of the time, described how entire regions like Illyricum and Thrace were plundered year after year by the Slavs, Huns, and Anti. The once thriving Roman provinces were turning into wastelands. And it didn't stop there. The Slavs eventually learned siege warfare tactics from their encounters with Byzantine culture. By 587, they were skilled enough to overrun cities and fortifications, which led to the collapse of Byzantine control in many areas. The Slavs started to settle in these devastated lands, sometimes replacing the native populations and often mixing with those who had survived. These Slavic groups established dense settlements across the region in what were once the provinces of the Roman Empire. They made their homes in places like Noricum, Pannonia, Dalmatia, Moesia, and Dacia Ripensis, among others. Even in Thrace, some Slavs were later relocated to Anatolia, where they became known as the Asia Minor Slavs. Once settled, many of the Slavs turned to paganism, and like much of post-Roman Europe, the Balkans entered a period often referred to as the Dark Ages. However, the influence of the Roman Church and the ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople soon began a process of Christianization, shaping the cultural and religious identity of these new settlers. Eventually, many Slavic tribes in areas like Pannonia and Dalmatia gained some level of autonomy, while others, particularly in the dioceses of Dacia and Thracia, fell under the control of the First Bulgarian Empire. In the southern Balkans, the Slavs were gradually assimilated into the Greek-speaking population, while in parts of present-day Albania, they were absorbed into the Albanian-speaking majority. And when the Slavs first arrived, they brought their distinct culture with them. But over time, their way of life started to blend with the local Byzantine cultures. Archaeological evidence tells us that most of their movement into the region came from the middle and lower Danube valleys. Their culture, known as the Epitesti Kandesti culture, was a mix of different Slavic influences. Some archaeologists argue that a majority of the Slavs who settled here descended from the Anti tribe, while others believe that groups known as the Sclaveni were more prominent, migrating from western Ukraine. In terms of timing, some of the earliest Slavic archaeological sites date back to the 5th century in places like Moldova. By the 6th century, we find traces of them in Romania, and from there they moved into areas like Transylvania and beyond. The Slavic presence in Hungary, near Slovenia and Croatia, dates back to the early 6th century, while in Bulgaria and the former Yugoslav regions, it was more common to see Slavic artifacts starting in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Greece, meanwhile, saw the Slavs arrive a bit later, around the 7th century. The Slavs typically moved along river valleys, although when they encountered resistance from the Byzantine Greek forces in the southern Balkans, they adapted and began traveling along mountain ranges instead. They were skilled in farming, introducing crops like millet and growing wheat, flax and other fruits and vegetables. They even learned viticulture and were heavily involved in animal husbandry, using horses in both agriculture and warfare. In more hilly areas, they lived as shepherds, while those near rivers, lakes, and seas took up fishing. They were also highly skilled in woodworking, shipbuilding, metalworking, and pottery. From a genetic standpoint, modern studies have provided some fascinating insights into the ancestry of the South Slavs. Research from 2013 shows that people speaking Serbo-Croatian share many common ancestors with populations from Poland and Romania, dating back to the migration period about 100 years ago. It's believed that this is linked to both Hunnic and Slavic expansions. Another interesting finding is that South Slavs have a bit less genetic proximity to the Greeks than they do with East and West Slavs, showing shared ancestry dating back to the time of Slavic migrations. Recent studies also reveal that the spread of Y-DNA haplogroups, especially R1A and I2, matches the expansion of Slavic populations from Eastern Europe into Southeastern Europe during the early Middle Ages. These lineages, first seen in the region during this time, are believed to have come from present-day Ukraine and southeastern Poland. Lastly, new archaeological genetic studies have shown that the Slavic migrations had a significant impact on the region. Populations before the Slavs had more Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, while modern people in southeastern Europe show a mix that includes a large amount of Slavic ancestry. Even in places like Greece, where no Slavic languages are spoken today, genetic evidence points to a significant Slavic presence during the early medieval period. This was a time of major population movements that shaped not just the language and culture, but also the genetic makeup of the Balkans.